we're gonna get started. So if anyone wants to enter the chat or unmute yourself for a second, you can just say where you're tuning in from. I'm here in New Jersey. It's kind of cold and windy today here.
Tennessee.
What was that?
I'm in Kingston Springs, Tennessee. Hi,
Oh,
my name's
hi from
Jen.
Tennessee. Are you cooking along today?
I am.
Oh, awesome. Okay. So if you are cooking along with me today, I just need you to preheat your oven to 375 and have your canned goods open. We have some canned tomatoes today, some cannellini beans, and then also some tomato paste. Also, if you've been with class with me before, you'll know, one second. That I always do slides in the beginning just for some nutrition education. So if you're still setting up and getting everything ready to go, that's totally fine. All right, so make sure your recipe is out and you can start with that prep as I'm going to just kind of talk through a couple things regarding cooking with your pantry. I like this recipe a lot because most of the stuff I always have on hand all the time. So it's easy to whip up for a quick meal. And this is fun for breakfast or brunch or even dinner. So I hope you like this, and we can also talk about how you can put your own little spin on it. All right, so if you're new to Virtual Teaching Kitchen provides free virtual cooking classes with that nutrition education, making it accessible for all. So as a dietitian, I love to educate about nutrition through the food that we eat. So we all eat food, so this is the perfect learning space. So today's class topic, every class we have a different nutrition topic, and it's cooking with pantry staples. And specifically, we're going to talk about canned goods today. And our recipe is a white bean shakshuka, if you ever heard of that term before. It's essentially just like a tomato stew that we're poaching some eggs in. So kids and adults who use 6 or more canned foods per week are more likely to have diets higher in 17 essential nutrients. So about 3/4 of the population is not eating the recommended amount of fruits and vegetables. And a well-stocked pantry of canned fruits and veggies can help you conveniently meet your fruit and veggie intake requirements. Plus, they're shelf stable, and you can always have them on stock, so when you ever can't get access to fresh. Because canned food is packed at the peak of harvest, it's also packed at its nutrient peak. So as our food ages, they begin to shed some of their essential nutrients, and fruit and vegetables especially have the highest nutrient content when they're at their ripest. So since canneries are located really close to the point of harvest, few, if any, nutrients are lost in transit. And there are some studies done in 1997 from the University of Illinois that the canning process actually may help enhance the nutrient profile of certain foods. So for example, canned pumpkin contains 540% of the recommended daily intake of vitamin A, while the same amount of fresh pumpkin only has 26. And other foods like canned beans may have higher fiber content, and canned tomatoes contain significantly higher quantities of lycopene, which is an essential phytonutrient that's found also in our fresh tomatoes, but it's going to be a higher concentration in the canned variety. So the canning process was developed to preserve food safely and for long periods of time. And once a food is packaged into a can, the can is heated to a temperature which kills all microorganisms. So step one, you see this little graph or this little image here. The fruit or produce is washed with water, and then depending on what it is, it might be trimmed, cored, sliced, or even blanched. And for beans, they'll hydrate the beans and then blanch them. Step 3 is filling the can with liquid, water, or juice, plus any seasonings. They close the lid and they heat it quickly to a precise temperature for the exact amount of time. So each item might be a different time depending on how much it would need. And then it's cooled very quickly right in the can. So the general rule of thumb is that canned food has a shelf life of at least 2 years from the date of purchase. It is recommended that you store all your canned food in moderate temperatures, so like in a dark pantry, either 75 degrees Fahrenheit and below. You should not go above that. So what do the dates, or what do the packaging terminology, what does all that mean? So you might see best if used by date, or freshness date is also written for this one. But this tells you how long a food will be fresh and at top quality if it's stored properly. So after that date, the products may still be safe to eat, but just might taste as delicious or as good. So foods by freshness date or used by date, you'll see things like bread, salad dressing, raisins, and cereal. Many canned products have a best for quality used by date, and that date is stamped at the top or bottom of the can. You won't really see expiration dates. They're rarely found on canned foods. Then you also have your sell by date. And this is the last day a food should be sold at the grocery store. So most foods will still be fresh and safe to eat for about a week or so after the sell-by date. So foods with sell-by dates are usually your cheese, milk, meat, and yogurt. Then you also have an expiration date. And this is the last day a food should be eaten and may not be safe to eat after the date is passed. So foods with expiration dates, usually something like baby formula, that is not safe to eat past that expiration date. So back to our canned foods. There's a lot of conversation when it comes to canned foods that people are concerned about potentially the sodium. So your canned vegetables, for example, or canned beans, there are so many options available that are low or no sodium options. So just look for that on the label. But additionally, by draining and rinsing canned food, it reduces sodium further by up to 41%. So if sodium is a concern, just make sure you're really rinsing all of your canned products to decrease that sodium by up to 41%. So the fact is that canned foods do not require salt or sodium for preservation, and manufacturers are increasingly answering that demand and creating more lower sodium varieties of our regular canned foods. And then when it comes to canned fruit especially, there's usually a nutrition concern about added sugar. So when things end up in a package or a can, you just need to be a little bit more savvy at looking at the ingredients and the nutrition label. So for something like your canned fruit, you want to look for something without that added sugar. So not packed in corn syrup, or it's packed in its own juice instead. Also, draining some of that is going to be beneficial as well if it does contain added sugar. There's also on the shelf for your canned fruit, they have fruit that's packed with non-nutritive sweeteners. That means they're using like an aspartame or like a Splenda or Equal to sweeten it up in that aspect. So just read your label and always go with what is towards your health preference and what your health goals are. So let's talk about some pantry staples. So canned beans. They're low in fat and cholesterol free, and 1/2 cup of canned beans provides between 20 to 30% of the daily recommended amount of fiber, depending on which variety that you're choosing of beans. So they're very affordable and quick to prepare. Pinto beans, for example, cost $1 less per serving as a source of protein and fiber than bagged beans when the cost of preparation time is considered. So they're already cooked in the can, and it just takes a minute to open that can, rinse those beans, and they're ready to be added into a dish or added on the side, however that you're using them. And canned tomato products, they are harvested with just in a few hours, and it captures those nutrients so we can enjoy them all year round. So I'm from New Jersey, and Jersey tomatoes in the summertime are delicious. But those fresh tomatoes in the grocery store or in the wintertime, they're not packing in that flavor that the summer tomatoes do. So when you have your canned tomatoes, you're getting that nutritional value at the peak of their ripeness. And when you process tomatoes, the lycopene is even more available for your body because the cooking opens up the cell walls of that tomato plant and allows the lycopene to be absorbed into your body, offering potentially more cancer protection and anti-inflammatory benefits. And 1/2 cup provides 20% of the daily recommended amount of vitamin C, which is key for immune function. And then last pantry staple I have is canned seafood. Nutrition guidelines suggest including seafood in meals about twice per week. And canned seafood like tuna or salmon can make it really easy and affordable to include that. So you want to think about having that as an easy protein source to prepare to add on salads, to make into salmon patties or salmon cakes. There's a variety of ways you can use both of those. And a 3-ounce serving of a canned seafood provides about 22 grams of protein. And again, it's that cost that we're looking for. Oftentimes, seafood may be not part of our budget, so that canned option is going to be really great. And another pantry staple besides the canned seafood, they have those little pouches now that are shelf stable. So you can just open that pouch, eat it on the go, grab some crackers with it. It can be in your desk for a while, and you'll have that easy protein source. All right, so let's cook with our pantry staples. So again, we are making a white bean shakshuka today. And this recipe, again, it comes together very easily. So first we're going to start with our mise en place. So does anyone remember what mise en place means? Go for it.
Putting things in place, putting your things in place.
Putting everything in place, exactly. So we're going to start with some of our prep. So we're going to start with our onion here and to get our garlic ready. So if you've taken a class with me before, this might be a repeat, but I always like to show how to cut an onion and in a very efficient way. So anytime you have an onion, you want to leave that root end intact because everything connects to that root end. So I'm going to slice right through it and create 2 flat surfaces for my cutting board. We want to peel it, so it's easier to peel if you actually take that other side off, that little tip. And I'm just going to peel it. In the corner here, you'll see I have a little garbage bowl. So it's always great to have a little bowl or a basket or whatever you want to use to collect any scraps. This onion is a little challenging right now. So shortcuts in the kitchen. It's totally fine to use shortcuts in the kitchen. You could easily use frozen chopped onions for this. Or you can use the pre-chopped onions that are fresh in the produce department if you have that available in your store. So I love cooking with onion. I pretty much add it. It's always the starting to a lot of dishes, your garlic and your onion. And when I used to work as a retail dietitian, I always would strategically do demos that cooked with onions and garlic because it would draw people over, that sense of smell that comes through. So as a refresher, to cut your onion, again, we're keeping that root end intact, and we're going to create levels first. So we're going to let our knife do the work. And if you see my non-cutting hand, my fingertips are going up, or you can have them down like this, but curl them in. We want to protect them. And we want to let our knife do the work. So I'm just letting it slide through, not all the way through, just enough so we create those levels you see here. Then you want to go across the ridge. Tip down, tip down, tip down. And again, you see my non-dominant hand, those fingertips are curled in. And then you're slicing it down and you have a nice dice. So depending on how big or small you want your dice, you would do different levels, the amount of different levels, or how many slices across the ridge there. So I'm going to put these aside and get to the second half. So it's always one of those roulette kind of days where is this onion going to make me cry or not? So your fresher onions, they actually, those coils, those rings are going to be tightly packed together. So those gases from the onions won't be released as much versus an older onion. Those ringlets start to come undone, or not undone, but they start to separate from each other. And you'll notice that sometimes even your onion is a little bit more wet as you're tapping it. But that is just going to create more fumes, so you may be a little more sensitive to those onions. All right, we have our onion. I have a little prep bowl ready to go here. And one mistake I see at a lot of my in-person cooking classes is we have our cutting board, and then we start chopping and prepping everything. And now our whole cutting board is covered with all of our ingredients that we're prepping, but there's not enough room to work. So always have these little prep bowls ready to go. And I find that to be very helpful. All right, if you've taken class with me before, you guys know I love garlic. So I'm using some fresh garlic today, and I already peeled some for us. But as a refresher, when you're peeling your garlic, blades should always be away from you. And you don't have to go crazy and whack it, just press down and apply enough pressure to get that peel off. So same thing, no judgment here if you are short on time or want to do less prep. If you want to buy the pre-chopped garlic, that's totally fine. I just recommend that if you are using pre-chopped, use a little bit extra of what the recipe calls for, just because when it's been cut and been sitting there for a little bit, it will start to lose its flavor. So it won't be as an intense flavor. So when you have a recipe that calls for 2 tablespoons of garlic, about 1 big clove would be about a teaspoon of garlic. So sometimes recipes will say like 1 teaspoon versus like 1 clove or 2 cloves, because look at these different cloves. This one's giant compared to this one. So I like to say measure garlic with your heart though, because if you like it, add as much as you want. So to start off, I'm just going to create nice little slices of my garlic. And you see that we want to practice this rocking motion. My knife is never leaving the cutting board. And I'm using the bulk end of my knife, this area right here, to do the majority of the slicing. I see a lot of people use the top, and you're not getting a good big slice because you want that pressure of the knife going down. So now we have our bunch here. And this is what I call the fan motion. You just go back and forth, and then you gather it up again. And you're going to break it down as fine as you want. So if you want a more mellow flavor, you're going to leave the chunks a little bit bigger. If you want a more in-depth, intense garlic flavor, the finer you chop it down, the more intense the flavor will be. So a little tip also too, if you don't love big chunks of garlic in whatever you're cooking, to break it down even finer, almost like a little paste, you can pour a couple salt crystals on your pile of your garlic and then continue to chop through, because those salt crystals are very coarse. So as it's cutting through, it's helping break down your garlic even finer. So far we just have our onion and garlic that we're prepping. And again, if you wanted to save some time, use that pre-chopped option. All right, so garlic is ready. I'm gonna add that to my prep bowl here. Give my hands a little rinse before we do the next step. All right, so before we add heat, I'm actually going to measure out my tomato paste. And tomato paste usually comes in these 6-ounce cans. And this recipe only calls for 1 tablespoon. So what do you do with the rest of it? What do you guys usually do?
Freeze it in like 1 tablespoon.
That's exactly what I'm about to show. Exactly. You're on top of it already. So I'm going to measure my 1 tablespoon here and set it aside. Let me get a little dish. But instead of just letting this go to get moldy in the back of your freezer or fridge, you want to freeze it. So the way I like to freeze it is I'll take a plate and then I have a piece of parchment paper. If you've ever battled with parchment paper with it rolling up all the time when you're trying to work with it, just crinkle it up. It sounds crazy, but now it will stay in place. And you can do this too if you're lining a baking pan or a baking sheet with that as well. So what you do is you take your tablespoon. Usually recipes when they call for tomato paste, it's about the 1 tablespoon. So like mentioned, you just take your tablespoon and you make these little dollops of your 1 tablespoon. And then you stick that in the freezer to harden completely. Then once hardened, you can put it in a little freezer safe bag or a little container. And anytime a recipe calls for a 1 tablespoon, you can just pop it out and it's ready to go. All right, so I'll finish the rest of that later, but I just wanted to share that tip so you don't waste the rest of your tomato paste. All right, I'm going to move my cutting board so we have this now in the center view. All right, so I'm using a cast iron skillet. You just need to make sure that if you are going to be putting this into the oven, you need an oven safe pan. If you don't have an oven safe pan, I have an alternative cooking method for you. So first things first, cooking is a transfer of heat. So I'm heating my pan up first. So you heat up your pan, then you're going to heat your oil. Then you're going to add your ingredients that you're cooking, because the pan's heating the oil is going to heat the food. The pan is not cooking the food. It's the oil now that is transferring that heat to the food. And what happens is if we add our oil into a cold pan and then add our ingredients that we're cooking with, all that oil just starts absorbing into the food. So as it starts cooking, things are not going to cook evenly. And your pan gets kind of dry because all that oil absorbed in your food there. Then you tend to need to add more. All right, my pan is nice and warm. Adding a little bit of olive oil there. Letting that get nice and warm. And since I'm using a cast iron, it's recommended to not use any like stainless steel because you'll scratch that. So you can either use a rubber spatula or a wooden spoon, whatever you have on hand. So you just want to make sure you're feeling that heat is warming up nicely. And if you know that you've waited long enough, because when we add our onions to the pan, you should hear a nice little sizzle. And that sizzle is your applause that you did it correctly. All right. So I have a nice sizzle here. I don't know if you heard it. And we just want to move around our onions a little bit so they're nice and coated with the oil there. So you always want to cook down your onions first, because if we add our garlic right now, our garlic is going to burn. What happens when we have burnt garlic? It's going to be bitter, and I don't think you want a bitter dish. I'm not looking for a bitter dish. All right, so as that's cooking down, let's talk through some of our ingredients. So I want a smoky flavor for this, but you don't have to have a smoky flavor. So I chose to use fire roasted tomatoes and smoked paprika. If you don't like that smoky flavor, you can use regular diced tomatoes and then regular paprika. Or you can ditch the paprika altogether and do other spices and herbs that you really enjoy. The beauty of this recipe, it is very versatile and you can really create it in whatever you have on hand or whatever your preferences are. So this recipe originally was created from just what I randomly had in my kitchen and we were trying to figure out what to have for dinner. So I'm adding a little bit of salt here, because the salt is going to help release some of that liquid from our onions. Plus, I season as I go. So a lot of our sodium intake is consumed by processed or packaged food. If we're cooking more at home, we're less likely to overconsume the amount of sodium that is recommended per day. All right. So these are starting to sweat and become translucent. That's what we are looking for. I'm going to add in my garlic. It's looking really good now to add in our garlic. And you just want to cook this down for a little bit longer until your garlic is nice and fragrant. So as it's cooking down, I'm just going to talk again through some of our ingredients. Eventually, we're going to be adding in some baby spinach, and I have this clamshell of baby spinach. And the way, after I open it, the way I store it is I make sure that I always put like a damp paper, a paper towel or a tea towel on top, or you can even put it in a bag of spinach, just so as it's sitting in your container, any condensation that accumulates that comes to the top or the sides of your bag will drip down on your paper towel and not wilt your greens. So make them last longer in your fridge. All right, we are going to add in our spices now. Adding our spices this early is known as blooming our spices, so it brings out that flavor even more. So I'm using 1 teaspoon of smoked paprika, and this is such a habit that I'm even trying to break too, but we really shouldn't be taking our open spices and pouring them over the heat. So I'm going to take my measuring spoon here, and then my spice is away from it, because what happens is some of that steam can end up in your dried spices and herbs, and they will start to get moldy. And then I have some oregano. So I'm going to do about half a teaspoon of oregano. And this is where cooking and recipes are just a guide, not a mandate. So you can create whatever flavor profile you want. Beautiful. All right, I'm adding my tomato paste at this point. Anytime you have tomato paste, you want to cook it down a little bit and almost brown it and get it coated with all your veggies that you're cooking, because just raw tomato paste is very bitter. And again, we don't want that flavor. So by cooking it down, it mellows out that tomato flavor a little bit more. My kitchen is smelling really good. How is everyone else's kitchen? The onion and the garlic. All the spices now.
Smells yummy.
So like I mentioned, I'm using our fire roasted tomatoes. I couldn't find crushed, so I am using diced in its own juices. So when you are making this recipe, you want to make sure that you're not draining those juices away. We need those juices. All right, my tomatoes are going in. And if you don't love the big chunks of tomato, you could always pulse this in the food processor a little bit, or just buy the crushed tomatoes. I'm going to add in my cannellini beans. You could add in really whatever beans you want. And I rinsed them because our fun fact of the day for our beans here is that by rinsing, you can reduce the sodium by 41%. So as that's starting to cook down, I'm going to start adding in my baby spinach. So you could easily just take a giant handful and throw it in, but I'm a little picky when it comes to my baby spinach, and I don't love the little stems, so I'm going to pull them all off. And something like any of your dark leafy greens, does anyone know any essential nutrients that are found in our dark leafy greens? There's a lot, so you could have a lot of answers.
Like vitamin A and iron.
Vitamin A, vitamin C, folate. But the one I want to talk about is iron. So your plants will have non-heme iron. Your animal sources of protein have heme iron. Heme iron is more absorbable in your body versus non-heme iron. But if you pair non-heme iron coming from our plants with a source of vitamin C, like our tomatoes, it is more absorbable. So if you're worried, if you have low iron levels and you want to include more iron in your diet, going for those dark leafy greens is going to be beneficial. So same thing with our leafy greens here. Measure with your heart. I'm not gonna be upset if you add more than 2 cups, but the recommended amount was for our recipe here. You can add kale, you could add Swiss chard, really anything you want. I just like the baby spinach because you don't really have to worry about chopping it. I just am picky and I like to take off all the little stems. My mom does it, so I feel like that's why I do it. Because we make this one spinach salad that you use raw baby spinach, and we always have to, whoever's job is to pick off all the stems, you're sitting there for a while because we usually make a really big batch of it. Always for parties. All right. But usually for me, I get sick of picking off the stems, so after a while, I'll just do another handful. I haven't tried frozen spinach in this recipe yet. That could easily work, but I would recommend thawing it out and squeezing it out all the moisture, just because we don't want to add too much moisture to the dish because we don't want it soggy. Because right now, the tomato juices are reducing and it's creating this nice stew. So I'm just getting my spinach to wilt down a little bit. And how are we doing? Are we at the same step? I see a head nod. Wonderful. Gonna add a little bit more. So your tomato juices should be simmering, bubbling a little bit. It doesn't want to be too hot because we don't want it to scorch the bottom of our pan. So if you don't love beans, you can skip the beans. You could add something else. I've done this recipe as well with some extra ground beef that I had left over. You could add that in there if you want to. I just like this one because it's so filling. You're getting protein coming from the beans and the eggs. All right, so we want to just cook this down until our spinach has wilted. And it's going to cook down more in our pan once we put it in the oven. You just want it to let it wilt down enough so you can put your eggs in. All right, so moving on to our eggs. This pan is pretty big, so I can probably fit more than 4 if I wanted to. But you want to make sure that you're creating enough room for everything, and then they won't like start bleeding into each other. So for the longest time, eggs were the enemy because they said, oh, the cholesterol found in eggs. But your egg yolk has a lot of key nutrients. And one nutrient in particular found in eggs is choline. And choline is really great for brain health. And egg nutrition and choline, it's great from ages like as little as when you're starting to eat real solid foods until you're elderly aged individuals. So those eggs and that choline is so good for our brain development. I'm gonna turn down my heat a little bit just so it's not bubbling as much. And we are going to create little wells in our pan. So we have a nice little spot for our egg to sit. So I'm going to actually crack my egg in a little dish first, just to make sure that it'll easily slide in to exactly where I want it to go. So again, create that little pocket. And essentially you're creating a little bed for that egg to poach in. So I'm going to do that 4 times. And try not to break your yolk if you can. Try to avoid it.
Too late for the first one.
What was that?
It says too late for the first one.
All right, I'm gonna do one more over here. And last one. So this is where if you want to cook them to your desired doneness. I liked my yolks to be a little bit runny. Some people like them cooked all the way through. So you can cook them like this for a little bit, but essentially we want those egg whites to whiten. Essentially, they're opaque right now. But we want them to whiten and cook to the yolk's doneness of what we prefer. So if you don't have an oven-proof pan, that's totally fine. This recipe, you could turn down the heat a little bit and just add a lid, and it will trap in that heat and that steam and will help poach and steam our eggs. So essentially we are poaching our eggs in this delicious stew. To make it a little bit easier, you could also pop this in the oven and it will cook again to your desired doneness. So I have my oven preheated. And one of my favorite kitchen things are my UV gloves. I find they're easier to hold your hot pans with. So this is going into the oven. All right, I set my timer for just 6 minutes just to see what they're gonna look like. But of course, you can do it again. Just keep an eye on it to whatever your preferred doneness is. All right, let's bring our cutting board back in the middle. If you notice here, I have a damp paper towel underneath my cutting board. It will prevent my cutting board from moving or slipping and sliding. And that's really important because the cutting board should not be moving as you're trying to chop away. So let me just give this a nice little wipe down. And we are going to work on some garnishes. So if you have fresh parsley, I bought this little pack because I knew we were only going to need a little bit. But if you have leftover, how do you store your herbs? That's the question that I get asked all the time. So one way is you can take a glass and fill it up with a little bit of water and pop the stems down into the glass. And essentially it's keeping your greens hydrated. Additionally, you can take a damp paper towel and just loosely wrap them in and put them in a container or a plastic bag. So when we have something like parsley, the stems actually have a lot of flavor, but they're not desirable necessarily for mouthfeel, not great for a garnish. But I tend to save them. I'll put them in a little baggie in my fridge or even freezer, and the next time I make a pesto, I'll throw them in there because then you'll get a nice pop of flavor. Also, when you're making a pesto, kind of off topic from today, but I guess you can drizzle a little bit of pesto on top of this. That could be good. Is when you have fresh basil and you're making a pesto, basil, when you're chopping it and breaking it down, it tends to bruise and brown a little bit. So using something like parsley can help brighten that color. All right, so I have some parsley here, and I'm just going to do that fan motion where you do that rough chop, and we are going to break it down. If you prefer cilantro, you can do cilantro. Do a little basil on there too. Basil would be pretty because you can do a nice chiffonade, which is a ribbon-like slice. And I recently started using a lot of, I forget the brand of it, but I saw these little containers of herbs that are partially dried and they're already chopped. So you store them in your fridge, but you can use them like as fresh. They're still fresh enough. They're just dried partially, I guess. And they last in your fridge for about 4 weeks. So if you know you like to use parsley, cilantro, or whatever they have in your store, and you like to use that as a garnish or incorporate that into a dish often, but you don't feel like buying the whole bunch, that could be an option. So our other toppings we are going to do is I have a little bit of feta cheese. I love feta. I do have an avocado. I don't know if it is overripe. It feels a little overripe, but we'll see when we cut into it. You could always add that on top. Again, whatever you have on hand. And I'm going to serve mine with some delicious, crusty sourdough bread. I toasted it. And to enhance that flavor a little bit more, I'm actually going to take another piece of garlic. Just trim it a little bit. And what you could do is when your toast is still warm, you can take your garlic and actually rub it on your bread so you can infuse some of that garlic flavor, but you don't have those big chunks of garlic. Not chowing down on just the big chunks of garlic. You can serve this along the side with like avocado toast, plain toast. I've done naan or pita bread. That works as well. What are you serving on the side with your dish?
I have an artisan like sunflower seed sourdough bread
Ooh.
and feta because nothing's better than right. And parsley. Pretty much what the recipe said.
Yeah, so with this recipe, I've done so many versions where you can add bell peppers into the mix, you can add mushrooms in there, really whatever you like, or again, what you have on hand. It's building off of our pantry staples. So having always those canned tomatoes, those canned beans regularly available to use and incorporate into your dishes. Not one, you're adding more produce, but two, you're adding some more nutrients. So that's what we're looking for to really bulk up our dish. I've done also a green version of this where I've used tomatillos as the base in place of our tomatoes with green peppers and a bunch of different kinds of dark leafy greens. I think I used collard greens, Swiss chard, mix that all in there to create that stew. So the possibilities are really endless. So I'm gonna check on my eggs real quick. They are looking pretty good. Again, I like my yolks a little runny, so I'm probably going to pull mine as soon as my timer goes off. I'm going to put in my little trivet here, and we are going to take a peek. So you can see here, again, it really depends on your preference of doneness. I think I could leave mine in a little bit longer. Like I can see here that it's not as white. And when I jiggle the pan, they're still pretty jiggly. Also, a little tip if whenever you are cooking with your cast iron and you put it on your stovetop or you're serving, a little tip is to put your oven mitt or a tea towel or something on the handle just to alert people that your pan is still really hot. So just be careful when you're touching it. All right, I'm gonna put this back in the oven just for a minute. It's just about done.
I have a question.
Yep.
So the egg that I broke, I still used it. So what am I looking for? Still the white or like the yellow is now, all spread out in there.
So your yolk is probably going to be cooked through a little bit more. So just to make sure your whites are cooked through all the way, so they're not that like opaque kind of color still.
Right. Okay. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions as we're waiting for our eggs to finish cooking?
I can just say I didn't know about the heat the pan and then heat the oil. And I'm kind of new to using cast iron. So, and I never did that before. Like that's not how I learned, right? So, but it makes a lot of sense the way you explained it. So totally doing that next time.
Yes, it's always about the transfer of heat. And how are you taking care of your cast iron?
So I watched a YouTube video. I rinsed it out with hot water after using it while it was still warm, and then Used a paper towel to dry it and put a little oil and then put on the burner low and then let it cool. And that's what I've done so far.
Perfect, exactly. So to take care of your cast iron, you don't necessarily want to use soap. I know some chefs say it's okay to use soap because the cast iron that we're using now, it's not going to degrade it. So really form your own opinion on it. I tend to not use it. I do really hot water. I rinse it down really well. I scrub it with a sponge even, but no soap. And like you said, dry it really well and then add a little bit of some oil. So I usually use like a canola oil just because it's a very neutral flavor. And I really rub it in and make sure you're like moisturizing essentially your cast iron. So you want to put it over your flame or your stove top for a little bit just so that absorbs and it's fully dry before you store it. And I even store my cast iron because in the kitchen, you're usually stacking things. I don't have the ability to have that just sitting there in its own little glory. So you can take either like something like a trivet or some paper towels, and you just want to put that down before you put something on top of it if you're storing it on top. All right, I think my eggs just beeped again.
I keep it in the oven. Should you do that? I feel like I'm gonna forget it and turn the oven on and
Oh, I don't do any of that because I will forget anything is in there. What show was there was a show or a movie or something where someone put like blankets in the oven because they don't use it and then like someone turned it on. I don't remember what it was, but yeah, I would forget. Oh, this is perfect. All right. So, as you see, I think I made my wells a little too deep for this one, but that's okay. I made a nice little cozy bed in the tomato sauce mixture. My yolks are still going to be a little runny, I can see here, but all my whites are nicely cooked through. So I'm going to add in my feta cheese, and I'm not going to be shy about it. You can use goat cheese here too if you want. You can even use Parmesan cheese. I love cheese. And we are adding in our fresh parsley. And what's fun about this too is now each person can just scoop out their egg or one or two eggs and dunk in their nice crusty bread with it. I'm just gonna give it a nice little dunk. You can break the egg yolk. You can see it's nice and jammy in there. Oh, it's gonna be delicious. I'm gonna take a bite. Let me hot. No, it's really good. Oh, the other thing that you could sprinkle on top too, or incorporate it within your spices, is any chili powder or fresh red pepper, depending on the heat level that you like. But I like the smokiness that comes from the smoked paprika and the fire roasted tomatoes. It adds this other layer of flavor. So along with our recipe, in that same folder where you downloaded the recipe and the information for the class, I added in some other handouts and worksheets from the Canned Food Alliance and also Tomato Wellness to discuss further of how to stock your pantry, key things of key nutrients that again are being more preserved in our canned foods versus our fresh. So canned foods does have a place in the kitchen and in with our health. And one of the big misconceptions with healthy eating is a lot of people are saying shop the outside perimeter of your store, but all of our canned goods are within those aisles. So shop up and down every aisle. There's always going to be some good nutrition in every aisle. Is yours ready? Let me see. Oh, that looks good. Fantastic. Yay!
Yeah, it tastes good. I just took it to my husband. What do you think, babe?
I got thumbs up. Woohoo!
It's hubby approved.
Nice. So always I like to kind of cook recipes as they are when I first try it, and then next time I cook it, turn it into something of your own. So I just want to say a big thank you for cooking with me today and the others who are watching. And if you're watching the replay, if you want to share with me after you make it what your thoughts are, I would love to see a picture of it. And if you post on social media, you can tag at Virtual Teaching Kitchen and use the hashtag made with VTK. So I'm working on some more classes. I'm actually going to be adding some kids classes to the schedule too, to get kids involved in the kitchen more and learn about nutrition. So if you have any class or theme ideas that you would like to see, don't hesitate to email me or reach out, because I want these classes catered to you and what you want to learn about. So a big thank you again, and I hope to cook with you again, and thanks for joining me in the kitchen.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun tonight. Thank you.
Yay! Hope to see you again.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.